We'll do our little. That's good. And I'm going to record too, Mary.
Okay.
Oh, ask the host to give you permission to record.
Uh-oh.
Can you give me permission?
I said I was an expert and I'm failing miserably. What's wrong?
Okay. Right. Well, don't worry about it.
Hold on, Joe.
Hmm.
I've made you co-host. So then you should be able to.
Okay. So weird. I just lost my record button. Oh, there we go. Okay. Now I'm recording too. Okay. So I'll do the little, we'll do our little bumper thing. Welcome to the Empathetic Imagination podcast, et cetera, and then I'll introduce you, and then Mary will throw you the first question, which is the, I think the definition of empathy question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or how you think about it. There was one question that we wanted to know your opinion, where you want to place it. I thought Mary's second question was really good. The idea of opening up to other artworks that inspired you or made you think about empathy. She put that in the email yesterday.
Oh, I honestly didn't look at it, but you can throw anything at me.
Okay.
So the question was that was what she was going to ask you. Can you think of any other artworks or
that
we
kind of grew your capacity?
What films have inspired you question, right?
No, it's not a what films inspire. It's what works of art in any form. It could be film, but it could be anything. Grew your capacity for empathy. You know, that sort of thing. So yeah.
Sure.
But
so we're trying to figure out if that would be better towards the front or towards the back of the thing, because we will spend most of our time talking about Sound of Metal.
That's a good question.
Probably since you haven't
wherever it comes is
okay.
I'm happy with it.
All right, so somewhere towards the middle or towards the end, probably. Then we'll give you a little time to chew on that. Okay. Thanks so much for doing this, Darius. I'm really excited about this.
Yes, thank you.
Great.
All right, ready? And here we go. Hello and welcome to the Empathetic Imagination podcast. I'm Joe Kikasola.
And I'm Mary McCampbell.
And we are so excited to have Darius Marder, the writer and director of Sound of Metal and other important films, here with us to talk about his work and to talk to us about his thoughts on empathy and wherever the conversation might go. We're so grateful to have you here. Thanks for your time, Darius.
It's great to be here. Nice to see you both.
Thank you so much. Well, we open up each podcast with the same question. And the question is, we'd like to know, curious to know how you define empathy, what empathy is to you. When I use that term, what do you think? Because it's different according to each person. So yeah, how would you define empathy?
I would define empathy as the state of feeling another's disposition. And it's not just seeing. I think feeling. And so yeah, and I think much of this conversation will probably be about feeling. It's something that fascinates me, and I think so often we are in our own orbits, and how often do we actually feel outside of our orbit and feel into another orbit and another disposition? So yeah, that's what I think empathy is.
Well, Darius, I mean, I've taught your film, Sound of Metal. We've talked about it at length. I had a chance to meet you a number of weeks ago. I told you then, I will tell you now, I will continue to speak it to everyone. Your film speaks on a sensory, emotional feeling level at in an extraordinary way. It was one of the things that most attracted me to the film. And of course, it moved me, but I also just felt like you were reaching for that level of communication as the dominant level of communication. It was like, I mean, the script is wonderful. I love the structure of the film. I love the story. I love the characters. But I almost felt like you were trying to make feeling the ascendant or the dominant mode of communication as opposed to, say, words or gestures or whatever. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. But that was my intuition on that. And if I'm right about that, it would seem that empathy is really, at least in the general sense, is driving a lot of your aesthetic. Could you speak to that?
Well, you're not wrong at all. And as a matter of fact, it's the only thing I care about. It is. I think everything else is secondary. I think that experience of feeling into or being in an experience in a film is the only thing that is of interest to me. And it's the hardest thing. I know that. You know, so everything in this movie, every single frame is oriented with a lot of intention toward that. And one of the simplest examples of that is that this film is a first-person narrative. That's a really unusual thing in a movie. You know, I challenge you to think of a lot of movies that have first-person perspectives. And when I say that, I mean the camera doesn't go elsewhere. You know, it doesn't cut to this person or that person, which that is a really bold thing to do because it's really, really difficult. You want, you know, to be able to relieve the pressure of a narrative by leaving is tempting. It you know, we're so used to television shows that jump to this person, that person, this person, that person, and people think that's clever, and it might be. It's also much easier. What is it to be in a perspective? And that was this dance in this film, was this dogmatic adhering to one person's journey vis-a-vis this experience of what I call point of hearing, you know, and rather than point of view, a point of hearing. So we're actually feeling through his ears. We're actually creating this hyper empathy machine that starts in the first frame, even though you don't know that it's a perspective at that point. But it is.
Can we talk about that first frame just a bit? And by the way, for those who are listening, watching the podcast here, we are not going to worry too much about spoilers here. I hate spoilers myself, but there is no way to do justice to this incredible film without talking about the whole of it. So we're just going to unburden ourselves in that way, and we urge you to go watch the film. And it's certainly available online in a number of different ways. And there will be many ways to see it in the future, we hear. So this is all very exciting. But that's just the spoiler alert up front. But the very first opening of the scene, it starts in darkness, but we do hear things. We're hearing, and what comes to what musicians would recognize as feedback from a guitar amp, or and then we open on Riz Ahmed's character, Ruben, sitting at his drum kit with an inky, endlessly inky black hole of a backdrop behind him. So it's really just this solitary man in a drum kit, kind of like a battle tank in front of him, and just a void behind him. And then the drums kick in with a very, very slow death march of a rhythm. I'm wondering, why did you choose to start the film that way?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. So, you know, one thing I was really interested in, from an auditory perspective, is I know that, or I suspect, and I've fixated on this idea that our body holds a kind of vibrational memory, which is to say, not unlike that thing when spring comes and we smell those smells, and we're like, our body has held the memory of the smell of lilacs, and suddenly are flooded with memory, with nostalgia. I think sound is similar. You know, we can hear a song, we can, or even just the rumble of a train or something. We hold those sounds as memories. And so what I was wanting to do in this film, in the beginning, in this opening, that opening frame is accompanied with this tone, with this vibration. Now, you don't understand that sound of metal, which is what it is also going to be vibrationally reflected literally in the last sound of metal that you hear in the movie, which is the sound of the bell. And that sound actually shares the same tonal vibration as that first sound in the movie. Because that sound of metal that you hear at the end, he's been looking for that sound the whole movie, trying to get back to that sound. To some extent, we all are trying to get back. You know, we're all, you know, I think that there was something very interesting to me about that frame where he sits mired in his own identity, this thing that's keeping him this side of the earth. You know, this thing that's this dependence he has, and in his place, behind his kit, in the void. And what happens when that's removed to this man? And, you know, so that frame is very specific in the beginning. It's also the same frame as the last frame in the movie. So, you know, yes, you're right. He is, in a funny way, it's all identity. He's got his tats. He's basically naked. He's got his little, you know, nod to, he's got his monitor in, which is a nod to what's coming, you know, in the end. And it's all there, right? All of his identity, all of the trappings, the muscle, the intensity, this kind of well of foreshadowing. In the end, his hair's gone, everything's gone. He literally doesn't have a possession in the world. The frame is light. There's nature. There's humanity. And it's a shedding. So those two frames are really important.
Yeah.
As bookends.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was thinking, I watched Sound of Metal a while ago, and then I rewatched it yesterday, and I was just aware of, I mean, I love punk rock. I was all, especially in high school, was very into it. So I'm used to the very, you know, loud kind of assault of noise and dissonance. You know, I'm drawn to that. But for some reason, this time watching the opening, I was really aware of how this is a impenetrable wall of sound that felt like an assault. Right.
Yes.
And then and it feels like it's out of control. But what's interesting is there's a sense of, you know, the dissonance, lack of control. But then, of course, the real lack of control comes when he loses that. But at the end, with the parallel frame that you're talking about, how that is such an assault. It's funny you said he's looking for that, but then when he it's unbearable. And I think it's really interesting then when he, of course, turns off the implant, or I don't know what cochlear implant, then that is freedom.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of Joe's comment about finding the stillness. So what could you say something about that transition at the end from the, you know, assault of noise? It's kind of like what we think we want isn't necessarily what we really want sometimes, you know, maybe, I don't know.
Sure. Well, first of all, I mean, I was really excited about the audacity of silence. Just that, like, why, you know, silence is very rare in a film. To have no sound in a film again, almost never happens. As a matter of fact, this was a long running argument with me and my sound team, who were like, it can't actually be silence, or people will think the film is broken. It can't actually be silence. It has to be like what you think is silence, but there's a noise, there's a white. And I was like, hell no, hell no. Now, the idea of silence is audacious in the sense that, and this was this kind of true north making the film, that the film had to earn that moment. How is it that we could feel, again, that word feel, a sense of catharsis with the removal of sound? What a simple idea, right? What a simple, audacious idea. Here you have this film with these hundreds of tracks of sound. I mean, this unbelievably complicated sound design. At the end of the movie is the easiest part of the sound design. There's no sound. So, you have this simple moment and shedding and being in. Can you feel that? How are you going to feel that? So that comes back to that concert you talked about in the beginning. I love how you call it an assault. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, that assault is meant to wake up your senses. As you begin this movie, you are waking up your senses. You're being assaulted, and you're meant to go, oh, shit, what do I do with this? It hits you hard. It's also mixed with this intensity of low frequency that is meant to hit deaf people as well. They can feel that vibration in a theater. Deaf audiences feel that song. So it's not just for hearing audiences. And by the way, deaf people go to a lot of metal and punk and hardcore and industrial music because they can feel it. Because low vibration, they feel it and hear it essentially in their bodies. So that's also part of it. That's also why drums are important, because you feel it. And it's also, this is the charge of their relationship. Even on the page, it's written almost as an orgasmic experience. This is the charge of their relationship. This is it. Even, it's meant to feel like some sort of almost kind of ferocious erotic exchange, which once lost, what's there? Because in a way, as a couple, there's an asexuality in real life. Lou is very kind of, she has an almost asexual aspect to her. So there's a lot at play with that music, and with identity, and with a sense of self.
Absolutely. And I just want to mention, it's so interesting about the vibration. I didn't realize that. I know that from going to many shows like that, feeling that in myself, but I didn't realize the low frequency with that deaf people would feel that. And I really like Shaheem. I followed his stuff on social media even before Sound of Metal, just because you learn a lot from watching him, and he's just a great dancer. But I saw an interview with him where he talked about how do I dance? He said, deaf people, we don't hear it, but we feel it. And that it's just so, there's such an embodiment there that reminds me a lot of what you're talking about, which, yeah.
So again, it's really interesting in this landscape or discussion around feeling, because excuse me, deaf culture, deaf language necessitates feeling. So it's not just in that sense of like feeling vibration or feeling sound, but feeling in general. The deaf community are such great actors because they're more present, frankly, just more present than hearing people. We hearing people are not present at all. We tend not to be. We tend to be distracted, or lost in our own thoughts, because our language doesn't necessitate presence. The deaf language, ASL, 50% of it is in your face. 50%,
Wow.
you know? So when someone says to us, you know, hey Darius, how you doing today? I say, I'm doing good. There's nothing in my face to suggest to actually suggest goodness. There's no connectivity of emotion. There's no feeling, right?
Mhm.
Whereas in ASL, you know, if this is how I would say this is how I'd say yes, right? I'd say yes, that's a yes, right? But if I want to say an emphatic yes, it's in my face. That's
Mm.
the way that yes is going to be felt, right? And as hearing people, we're so uncomfortable with that. We're so uncomfortable with feeling and with emotion and with actual connectivity, not to mention physicality. Deaf people are very physical. They touch each other a lot. We
Mhm.
don't do that. So there is this experience of feeling just interacting with the deaf world, which was so wonderful in this movie. And they are more empathic. They are.
Mm.
Their culture necessitates it.
Wow.
So
Fascinating.
I have about 15 things coming off. That was such a rich little moment there. So many things packed in there. I think probably for those who are listening, who haven't seen the movie, who haven't paused yet to go run and watch it, I probably should just recap that this is a movie about a drummer in a, I guess you'd call it heavy metal band. It's really more of an experimental rock band, really, who loses his hearing. And this is all in the first 15, 20 minutes of the movie. Most of the movie is about his journey trying to deal with this horrendous new circumstance that has completely disrupted his life, and ask himself how horrendous it actually is. Is there another way of living? Is there another way of being after such a calamity? And then the last part of the movie is about him making a very distinct and critical decision to get a cochlear implant. And I notice in this film, and going back to the first question about how you thought about this film on the sensory level, is there seems to be like 3 levels of sociality or kind of communication between people going on here. And this is reflected in the soundtrack. So we have normal, quote unquote, right, which is just the way hearing people typically hear in movies. And that perspective comes in and out throughout the movie, but it is the dominant perspective in the first part of the film, and then not so much in the middle. And then there's a mix, and but then there's also what is Ruben's perspective after his deafness, right? After the trauma. And then there is this third, well, there's actually 4, right? Because there's the third one would be after the cochlear implant, which is extremely important because it's a mix of quote unquote natural with highly technological electronic kind of feel to it, manufactured sound, really. The fourth level, though, and this is the one that really interested me in coming off of your comment, is there's a whole thing with the deaf community that it's very, very difficult to explain. But on the sonic level, we would call it normal, because largely you're just recording with normal microphones from normal positions. The sound recording technique is the same. It's just that people are not talking very much. They're signing. And we as an audience have to be okay with that. We have 2 choices. We can either leave the movie and leave this wonderful group of people, or we can be drawn into it. And we can try to live as they live. And this, of course, is what Ruben is having to do as he's introduced to this deaf community, which, for the record, is a recovery community. It's basically a community of people who are recovering from addictions, but they're all deaf people. So it's a very particular kind of place and community. So kind of leaping off of what you were just saying, was it deliberate? I mean, how did you think about those levels of soundscape in terms of making the audience connect? I imagine there were some real inherent challenges in there because you're thinking about a hearing audience primarily. But did you think of it in terms of those different kinds of soundscapes? Did you think of it in terms of different audio designs in these kind of 3 or 4 different ways?
Absolutely. I mean, the acts of the film are defined by the soundscapes. The acts of the movie being sound, the first act, the second act of, which means to belong to or be part of a group, and the third act metal, which is the implant, the shiny object. The so there's an absolute kind of it's a journey of sound in 3 acts. But it's also meant to be as much for the deaf community as hearing. And that's kind of an interesting and almost ironic thing, because sound is so important for the movie. But as you said, Joe, coming into the deaf community, and this gets back to this issue of empathy, this commitment to perspective and commitment to empathy and commitment to feeling was really something that interested me, and everyone who worked on the movie. So when you get to this deaf community, to a community that most hearing people never step into, and it's, again, this is a deaf with a capital D, which means culturally deaf, which is different. You know, we never get to visit this community. We probably, you know, most people never will. But what you do in this film is, because it's a first person perspective. So if Ruben doesn't understand sign language, either do we as hearing people. And what that creates is an experience both for hearing and deaf people. So for a hearing audience, we are, for the first time, a minority. As we watch the movie, we are a minority. We do not get the information that a deaf audience does get. So it's a very fascinating experience, a cultural experience, watching this movie in a theater with a deaf audience and a hearing audience, because you hear this laughter from the deaf audience. And the hearing audience is like looking around like, what happened? Now, interestingly, that's what deaf people feel all the time. Yeah. They, in the world, they're like, what happened? Right? Why is everyone laughing? Because they're the minority in a hearing world. But it's flipped here. So as an audience, we have to be a minority. We have to be in a place where we are not in control, where we do not get the information. So what that does is it creates a hyper empathy for this character who's in this position of not knowing, because we're in there too. And yes, it's a struggle, but that's where empathy comes from, right? Because we're not generally empathic from a place of comfort. We must step out of our own comfort in order to be empathic, which is why people don't do it, you know, because most people align their lives as comfortably as possible. Uncomfortable to feel the pain. It's uncomfortable to look at the news today. It's uncomfortable. And we tend to numb ourselves to it. So this movie asks us to step into it. And this is one of those places, very exciting, because on a cinematic level, because how often in films are we asked to be uncomfortable and in service of a story, in service of a journey? And that that also is interesting to me, because it follows a very distinct shape, which is that we're in this place where we really have to feel lost in it, and I think we do. And then there's this funny moment that happens on a slide with a child, and this experience with a slide on a child is something that hearing and deaf people watch on the same plane. There's no talking. It's a transference of energy, of vibration. And again, that boom, boom on the slide, that's something a deaf audience feels as well. That's something, because you're literally hearing it through a deaf perspective. And there's this reflective quality. That character of Michael on the slide was someone we wrote, my brother and I wrote a lot about Michael, this child, Michael, who had a lot more. He, you know, this is what he ended up with in the film, but he had a whole story. And and Michael, you know, is ADHD like Ruben, and he's meant to reflect Ruben. It's Ruben's child, you know, there on the slide, and they're reflecting, he's communicating with his child. And in communicating with this child through this transference of energy, remember the, you know, sound, the definition of sound is vibrations that connect one thing to another, you know. So here it's happening, boom, he's being connected. And this is what I am interested in, is like, we often think of catharsis and the opening of the soul as being something cerebral, like it's something we learn, or it's something we hear, or we have a, you know, we have a moment of going, oh, eureka. But really, you know, it's, you know, I think true catharsis has to happen here in our bodies, you know, has to be about actual connection. So this connective auditory experience that we feel, again, an audacious scene in the sense that I wondered, can we feel this? Will we feel this? You know, I love that scene. I loved it prior to shooting it. I thought, oh God, I love this scene, but I didn't know. Would we feel it? Would it feel cathartic? Would we feel connected? And then that scene births us into this experience of shots of nature, which are about connectivity. And then all of a sudden you come into a frame, and Ruben's with the kids. And what happens? You suddenly have the sign language captioned for the first time in the movie. Now that's the exact half point of the movie. And it took a long time to get it there, and it needs to be. That slide scene happens exactly at the midpoint of the movie, and to the second. But that captioning of ASL at that point, we now get to be a part of this community as Ruben becomes a part of the community. And in subtitling that ASL for the first time on that frame, we know that we have jumped in time, that he has learned sign language. And if we don't know that, we're just, I don't know what to say to you, but we do, we know. And you know, again, cinematically and narratively, I'm really interested in that language that, as Paul Schrader said, you know, in transcendental cinema, you know, that language that gets us to lean into the movie, where we go, oh, where we go, oh, what is that? Why do we know sign language now? What happened, right? And we have to, and our brains get busy. That makes us lean in. Whereas when we're told everything, for instance, 4 months later, right? You put 4 months later, when we lead the audience like that, we lean back as an audience. We go, we're good. We're good. You know, we're going to be told what to do. And it's not a good place to be when you're watching a movie. You don't want to be leaning back. You want to be in it, you know? So that's the language, cinematic language, I was really interested in constantly cultivating in this film, if possible.
I think it's, yeah, that's beautiful. And I find it interesting too, that it was children, it was interacting with children that seemed to lead to the kind of breakthrough where Ruben seems to be accepting and to entering in the community. And of course that doesn't last. So, you know, it doesn't last, but I'm wondering about the choice of using children, and how that relates when you were talking about, you know, empathy, being empathetic. It's not typically our natural choice. It's hard. It takes work. You have to be vulnerable. And I'm just, you know, watching that scene when he walks in, and I'm thinking about how humiliating that must have been for him, that he's having to go into a classroom with little kids to learn sign. It's like he's having to revert. But in a way, is that what we all have to do to try to really enter?
That's right. Very much on purpose. He's infantilized.
Yes.
You know, he's not only having to be with children, he doesn't know what they know. Right? I mean, he's having to be his smallest, most humble self. He's literally going back to infancy. And that's on purpose, again, in the sense of the therapeutic process asks us to return, you know.
Absolutely.
We have to go back to that place and build from that foundation. We can't just start here with all of our guards and our everything and our control. He's asked to be a child. And the children around him holding up the R for the first letter of his name, you know, and they're all kind of, you know, they're just doing that because they see this guy. They're happy and proud to be able to help this grown up, and he's having to be a child. So yeah, that. But the healing coming through children is very personal to me, for a number of reasons. One of them is probably the foremost reason is that when I was young, I was in a very hard time in life in my late teens, having graduated from high school, had no interest in going to college. I thought it felt like babysitting to me, and I just didn't want it. I wanted something richer. And but I was having a really hard time, and you know, I was just kind of exploring that edge. You know, it was a dangerous time in a way. My 7th grade teacher reached out to me, my English teacher, who recognized something in me and asked if I wanted to come and teach with her. And so I took those college years, and instead of going to college, I taught children for 4 years, middle school for 4 years. I taught English and writing and coached soccer and chorus and everything. And it was the experience of working with children that healed me. You know, it was the healing power of helping another. It was the healing power. And it wasn't just, you know, it was helping, you know, teaching is a very therapeutic activity, as filmmaking is, but it was also teaching writing. You know, I was very locked as a writer, very locked. And teaching those children how to write was teaching myself how to write, you know. So that experience of healing through children and that connective experience of play and it is fundamental to my own experience.
That's such a great tie-in to what I've been thinking. I mean, ever since you mentioned Paul Schrader, and I know Paul a little bit, and we've had a number of conversations, and I love his book, and he talks a lot about time, right? So this leaning in business is also for him largely contingent on editing patterns. How much are you going to take the time or force the audience to sit there and observe something, et cetera? Children have a similar approach to time. It's not as regimented. It's not as tyrannical, right? And yeah, hopefully, exactly. And there is a different sense of time in that middle part of the movie. And as a drummer, he's a timekeeper.
Yeah.
And as a recovering addict, there's a whole number of things about his character that are bent on a very adult and particularly Western view of time, which is that the game of time in that paradigm is to predict well, right? There's past, there's present, future. A lot of theorists would say all of them are present in our perception of time, but the real game is in prediction. What's coming next? Mastering that, knowing that, being prepared for that. Don't get caught with your guard down, you know, et cetera. And yet when he's on the slide, first of all, you take hearing away, and every psychologist and neuroscientist will tell you you've taken away one of the primary tools for comprehending time and perceiving time. The great trick with that, and the great mystery, is it's not the only way to perceive time, and the deaf community knows this well. But he hasn't learned that. Ruben hasn't learned that yet. And time then, through another lens and through other experience, becomes a different kind of time. It just takes on a different character. And that scene on the slide with the child Michael at the top and with Ruben at the bottom, the beat, the drumming that characterized the movie, or opened the movie, right, as an act of mastery, right, an act of power, becomes an act of really gentle communion. And it's not so much heard as it is felt. And I love the fact that you had Michael putting his ear down on the slide, as if a child putting his head in his father's lap. It's a very, very endearing image. And time and rhythm becomes far less tyrannical at that moment. And I think Schrader would smile on that. I think I'll have to ask him next time I talk to him about the film. But I mean, that's what came to mind. I don't know if you can speak to that at all, but it is my favorite scene in the movie as well, partly because time is redeemed in our experience there.
Well, it's such a lovely way of putting it. And I think that, I also thought about timekeeper, and, it's interesting about keeping time because it's something we can't do, it's not graspable. And sound is the same way. There's no way to grasp a moment of sound. It's constantly moving. And as Ruben said, you can't freeze frame sound like you can an image. It's just, it's time itself. Sound is time itself. And, as Ruben says, it just passes. And indeed it does. It just passes, but does it pass us by? So this idea of keeping time on that slide, what is it to be one with time? And the interesting thing about that as it relates to the presence of time is that we as humans have a heartbeat. Our hearts are our timekeeper. And we share that fundamental primal beat. And so in a way, it's that connecting with that heart, that heart energy that, he doesn't, on that slide, he doesn't, he's not like doing something fancy or anything. It's like, it's a heartbeat, connecting those two. And it is the time we keep, and it is the time we share on this earth together. And so I think that time and sound were very important to me. And, Joe, your awareness of this is so wonderful because it's something that a lot of people haven't brought up. But it's very important to me because time plays a very specific role in the editing of this movie, which is to say, and this is something, it would be fun to talk to Schrader about, but it's my own version of this kind of adherence to time. And what I mean by that is that, the film is dogmatically linear. It doesn't go forward, it doesn't go backward. But not only that, but it's built on hard cuts, which means that it's every cut is as hard as possible. They don't merge. There's no visual dissolve ever in this movie. There's no fade in this movie. There's no audio dissolves bringing you from one moment to another moment. Why? Because what is that? That's not how time works. This is the power of the cut. When you move from one cut to another cut, you have moved in time, and it is passing, and it's asking you to sit in that moment. It's asking you to sit in that time, and be present in that time. The whole film is asking. That's what I was interested in, that, and interested in that moment again, earning that final moment, hopefully earning it, when you suddenly sit in that cut, you sit in that experience of having been thrust into silence, and you can actually feel. But I don't think that you couldn't just do that. You can't just feel that at the end of this movie. You have to earn your way to feeling that. And it was very, very hard to earn that.
I wanted to just switch gears a little bit and ask you, because of course, Ruben, we are thrust into this position of empathizing because we're really sharing his experience and feeling the discomfort of it as a person who's lost his hearing. But also there's the added layer of the fact that he's an addict. And I was interested in why you chose to make his character, I mean, I feel that's when Lou calls, the first person she calls, I'm guessing, is his sponsor. What is he going to do? Because, this is, and was that written in as an opportunity to have him, go into the community house? I mean, that's obviously really significant, but yeah, there are two different layers here, but they work together. So I just wanted to ask you about that.
Well, the film is much more about him being an addict than it is about him being deaf.
Mm.
And part of the reason that um, he goes deaf so quickly in the movie, right?
Mhm.
Like you get your ordinary world, but the rug is pulled out really quickly because the conflict hasn't really started yet.
Mhm.
The conflict isn't really the deafness.
Mhm.
Conflict is the addiction.
Mhm.
And that monster is lurking from the first frame in the movie. That's that abyss. That's that thing he's keeping at bay. And so the addiction and that aspect of his person is essential to the energy of the movie. It's asking us the question of what are we and who are we when you remove these myriad addictions that we have. His addiction is quite real, and it was heroin, etc., but he's also in a codependent relationship, and there's a reason there's Codependence Anonymous. There's he's also addicted to his identity.
Mhm.
And we all are, I think.
Mhm.
We all wake up and download an identity for ourselves every single morning, not necessarily who we are. We are many things, but we choose to kind of continually reinforce a chosen identity for ourselves. And when that identity is challenged, we tend to, it unearths our essential natures.
Mhm.
Um, and, obviously the loss of hearing is a challenge to his essential nature. It's a challenge. It unearths his essential nature. It's a challenge to his construct. And so the whole movie as as seen through the ears, or felt through the ears of an addict, I think it invites us collectively to feel into how we are all addicts, you know.
Mhm.
um and I know that happens. I think that people, how often do they say, oh my God, I can't imagine if I mean, oh man, if I lost my hair, I can't imagine, and all this kind of stuff. And I think to myself, okay, sure, but is that really the issue?
Mhm.
Or is it like, as Sartre said, like all of man's problems are attributable to his inability to sit alone in a room,
which is literally a scene set of
Yeah, because
scenes.
you don't want to face yourself. And I mean, that's really interesting about in like Christian theological terms, we talk about idolatry, the idolatry things that you define your identity on. And it's interesting that in a way, his identity was so defined in this relationship, but also who he is as a drummer. He's a band. He's a cool guy. He's living in an RV, and the thing that gives him the key to that, he loses. So who is he? It's like he's just this empty. What am I? What's actually there?
Who is he? What is he? What's
Yeah.
there? Yeah. If you take it all away, what's left?
That's,
And we all have to ask ourselves that question. If the mantra that I had going while writing, and my brother and I talked about, is, if you take away all of this, am I enough?
mm,
Mm.
Am I enough?
I think it's really important. I love that you're bringing up the identity question, because that is really at the heart of the whole movie. And there's all kinds of ways. The codependence with Lou is that, I mean, they're wearing each other's t-shirts throughout the movie, and you see these things subtly switching. And there's a whole kind of suicide theme that's kind of hanging around in the background that they both end up kind of voicing at different times. And that's a really, really critical part of the dialogue, I think, and particularly in the middle part of the movie. But I also think it's extremely important. One of the most unnerving things for him is when he enters the community is they give him a name. They give him a sign name, which is this gesture of an eye opening, a wide eye. This is Reuben. And of course, his first reaction and our first reaction would be, no, I know my name. Don't take my name. Don't tell me what my name is. I know what my name, and of course, and as an outsider, not yet an insider, he feels threatened, as anybody would, and they are poking fun at him a little bit. But what comes to understand is that you never really find your identity by naming yourself. A name is something that has to be given to you by a group, by a power. In Christian theology, I would say it's God names us, right? And we all have our different ideas of what identity is, but what most people agree on is you can't just decide who you are. And those who do end up very unhappy and usually flailing about.
That's that discussion of identity again. Aren't we doing that every day and deciding who we are instead of listening, watching?
And I know Mary has one last question that's a good one that I want her to ask, but I gotta bring this up because it's really important for the podcast and this idea of empathy. We're big fans of empathy. We think we need lots more of it, and we think your film's done a great service to us in advancing us down that road. But it's not as simple as, oh, just get more empathy, is it? Because in Lou's and Ruben's relationship, one of the virtues of your movie and the way you wrote those characters is I think they really do love each other. They have a very sweet, tender relationship. And there is definitely empathy there. They think of each other. They try to imagine each other's futures. And when they talk about the future, Lou is fiercely arguing that the band has to stop because it's not safe for Ruben. And Ruben is fiercely arguing that we have to keep touring because this was her dream. And, they care for each other. And
Absolutely.
yet it's in the context of codependence. And I don't think it's as simple as you got to choose between empathy and codependence or something like that. It's just that empathy can get tangled up in unhealthy sorts of patterns. And it's almost like, what is the end of your empathy? What is the ultimate goal of the empathy? And how much have you dug down for your motives for the empathy? Right. So that's one of
when you're, but the codependency comes from his lack of there, maybe both of them, her character, we don't know as much, but his lack of identity, like he's clinging. I'm just thinking about that idea that someone like Henry Nouwen talks about, that if we don't have a strong sense of our own identity, then we end up kind of devouring other people and like using them just for our purposes. And it becomes a kind of narcissism, not in the clinical sense, but so sorry, I just interjected because I've just been thinking about that a lot. Yeah.
Well, again, it's not so much that he has no identity, it's that his identity is so aligned with her. And again, what is identity at all? Identity, we identify with this sense of self that so often is a construct. So he is so aligned, and I think it's a synonym for relationship. I dare you to show me a couple that's not codependent. It's very rare. And theirs is a little more cinematic in the sense that they're keeping each other alive. They're not just playing music. They're keeping each other alive. There's a lot at stake in their relationship, and that's on the page. It's on the screen. How long has he been in recovery? 4 years. How long have they been together? 4 years. It. And so there's a lot at stake. They have a massive amount of love for each other. They have so much love for each other that she would leave and go to the place she most doesn't want to go, and that he would go to that community, which is the place he most doesn't want to go. And he does that for her. He doesn't do it for him, right?
Right.
And you want to know the ultimate act of love? He leaves her warm bed. What could be more loving than that? Than to recognize you have to walk away, because you're recognizing, just as you say, that fallacy that he is protecting her is in fact hurting her. And he has to see it and feel it. How, with a simple gesture of a scratch, right? Now that plays again as a bookend. The scratching happens the first time you see them in the movie. It's a small gesture, but you might see her cutting scars. And it's all there. But when she does that again, that scratch signifies the cutting. That's a self-harm, right? So, that person that your idea, it begs the question, what is love? What is love? If love is hurting, if our love is hurting another, what is love? And again, I think it's a synonym for relationship. I don't think it's unique to Ruben and Lou. I think it happens almost invariably. Real pure love is sometimes the act of walking away. That's actual love. What we know that with our children, it's like that poem, our children are not our children. They're the sons and daughters of life longing for itself. That's what it is. We mustn't hold on too tight. It's the hardest thing. And so, there's so much love. And as a matter of fact, it's what I don't think a story can be a story if that love isn't present. There's love everywhere in this movie. There's love between Joe and Ruben. It's essential because it's the guiding force. And then ultimately, what is it to have love for oneself? And that's the ultimate love, because without it, you can't really do much else, I think. I think another thing I was going to mention is when you mentioned the naming, Ruben's eye, there's something specific in that, which is just to say that, this point of hearing that you're enmeshed in this film, there's also another cinematic choice at play, which is to not give you a point of view. So you don't get the point of view, which is a cinematic tool that I actually removed. So in other words, when Ruben peeks out the window in the beginning, you don't look out the window with him. Why? You're actually already in his point of hearing. It's all about the noises outside. What is he looking for? But it's trying to awaken that perspective for a reason, which is that, yes, his name ironically is eyes, right? The owl, the sea, it's the eye, but yet he doesn't see until the last part of the movie, when he looks up, and suddenly cinematically we look at that steeple with him. We look at the sky with him. So that's the first time you employ that language of view. That's the first time he's seeing.
Well, thank you so much. This has just been such a rich and wonderful conversation. I do want to ask you one more question before we wrap it up. And that is, could you share with us a work of art? It can be film, novel, music, anything that you've found that's helped you to have a greater capacity for empathy, that's really, really helped you grow in that area?
So much. I was rereading this Rilke poem, You Must Change Your Life. I don't know if you've ever read that, but it's so, I guess Rodin asked him to go into the Louvre and look at this. The poem's actually called The Archaic Torso of Apollo. He asked him to go look at this torso. So he wrote this poem that I can't recite the poem, but he's looking at this headless form of Apollo, this torso, and he's imagining these eyes that once burned with the fire of life, and he's thinking about this body and these loins and this area that once was procreating, and this energy and this life force, and there's this moment of like a sudden jolt of energy in this poem, and I don't remember the line, but it's something to the extent of now everything sees you. And then there's this gestalt line, the last line of the poem, which comes almost from the heavens, which is, you must change your life. And there was this poem, such a wonderful kind of process you go through of, you know, when you look into that aspect of humanity, and then suddenly you are seen. Once you are seen, there's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere to go. You must change your life. So that poem has this wonderful kind of empathic effect on me, because in a funny way you feel seen when you read it, and it begs you to kind of enter into that space of transformation.
Darius, that's just so wonderful. It really gets to the heart of why we're doing this podcast. Is Mary and I have been friends for many years, and so much of our friendship has been talking about art and movies and culture, and because we both feel very strongly that these are forms that help us to be seen. And in the case of Sound of Metal, I felt that I was heard, but not in a way of me speaking, but in someone else understanding my hearing experience. And as you know, because we've talked a bit about it, I'm not deaf, but I do have a hearing deficit, and it's it's a challenge in my life. But it's also just a part of my life. It's always been a part of my life. When I saw your film, part of what made it so powerful to me was that it was painful, and that it was incredibly affirming at the same time. And I think that's what empathy does. I was saying to Mary before we started the podcast, because we were talking about a lot of horrendous things in the news today and how hard it was to even get ready for the podcast, because we're trying to be empathetic. And we actually had to kind of stop for a second so we could do this podcast. And we know we have to go back and start again. There is a cost to empathy. If you're really going to enter into the world, there's a cost to it. There's a pain. There's a pain to being seen, because that means you're naked. And there's you have to be humble, and you have to be willing for your flaws to be seen. But there's also an incorporation and a communion and a being seen and heard that is incredibly healing. And I certainly felt that way in watching your film. And so it's just been such an incredible privilege to talk with you today. Thank you for giving so much of your time to us, and most of all for sharing so much. I know this was a 12-year project, so you really did share your body, heart, and soul with us through this movie. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, guys. Such a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.